Well, again, thanks to Phil and the Community Resilience Guild for putting this together. I'm Aaron Sawatsky Kingsley, and Phil asked me to help moderate this conversation this evening. Let's see, before this evening, the last time I spoke with Ron, I think was the morning right before the February flood crest, and you were kind of marking where we were at that point and making a guess as to where we were headed. We were both out on the Millrace, kind of taking stock of what things looked like at that point. The last time I spoke with Roger Taylor here was just this afternoon. He and I worked together at the Goshen Parks Department. Roger has been an employee there for 41, almost 42 years. Is that right? So what we have here are two historians who have experience of the Millrace in somewhat different capacities over the bulk of their lifetimes. And my job here tonight is just to kind of help prompt the stories to come out. We'd hope to have Ron Suggs here tonight also, who has been at the Parks Department for almost 40 years. And my personal experience with Roger and with Ron is that when you get the stories going back and forth between them, it's a really good time, and all kinds of interesting anecdotes come out. So I'll do my best to play Ron to Roger. I can't do it justice, but I'll do my best to try to pull some stories out that way. So I'll take a seat so that I'm not in the way. One of the striking things about the video that we just saw is the amount of history that's associated with this Millrace, which we don't have much evidence for anymore, at least in the landscape, especially the north end of it. I thought I might start by asking you, Ron, what are some of the other what details can you offer about when that portion of the Millrace began to disappear, and maybe what even prompted that, if you have some idea, some knowledge about that.
Well, the transition from water power to steam to electricity, with the addition of a couple railroad spurs in Goshen, allowed the industry to not focus on the Millrace. They filled in along the main rail lines through Goshen. They filled in along what is now the Marion line that heads south. It has more trains than it used to. And as they relocated or grew, in the case of Goshen Manufacturing and Goshen Sash and Door, they just kept growing, so they moved to different plants. I would say that was the beginning of the transition in that area. The fact that the truck service took over for the rail service also complicated things after World War II, because no longer did the railroads have the exclusive ability to deliver and transport raw goods and finished goods directly from the factory to the markets. And so as the rails cut back and the trucks took over, then there was absolutely no sense in relocating any new factories down there. Mogul Rubber hung on for a long time. You had the Barler and Anderson Bowling that filled in at the Hawks Furniture Company for a long time. The co-op took over some grain and feed operations there at Lincoln and 2nd Street, and then they built their hatchery there at Lincoln and 2nd. So there's been some residual. But the land that got filled in just never really developed more than just a few factories. That's a brief description of what I think happened. And now it's just recreational with the new housing units, which are fun, and there's plans for new recreational facilities.
Roger, one of the things that you noted as we were watching, and something that I've heard you and Ron talk about, is that when you guys started at the Parks Department in the 70s, mid and late 70s. The Millrace path was just kind of a narrow. I've heard you describe it even as kind of a cow path.
Yeah, that's about what it was.
Do you want to describe a little bit some of the work, some of what you experienced that old trail as? And I know that I've heard you talk about, I can't remember his name now, who was kind of in charge of maintaining the Millrace at Leroy Baker. You can use the mic. I think it's on. Describe a little bit about what working along the Millrace at that point was like, if you don't mind.
Well, it was a lot of hard work, believe me. We used to trim it by hand with weed eaters from the dam all the way to the tailgates building, and it would take us about 2 weeks to do that. There was a guy named Leroy Baker. It was kind of his little department there, and he took care of all the weeds that's growing up in the Millrace now, and it really looked really good. I wish we still had, that machine that they used back then. Do you remember that? That thing would go down under the water and it would cut all them weeds, and it really looked good. But the thing just got old, and we ended up just getting rid of it, But it was a lot of hard work to try to keep it up.
So he had a sort of a flat bottom boat that had a cutter, you said, that could be lowered down into the race and then could cut.
It
out.
looked like a little barge, and it had this like hay cutter, and he could drop it under the water, and it would just cut all that stuff. And then a day or two later, it would float to the tailgates, and then he'd go down there and they'd clean it up. And they did that periodically during the year. Looked good though. Looked really nice. He did a good job.
So the next question that prompts me then is, Ron, growing up along the Millrace as you did, what kind of maintenance do you recall, and how would it have been maintained historically, especially when it was an active power source?
I think the fact that it was an active power source answers your question. NIPSCO was responsible for maintaining the Millrace, and they maintained the race bank, and there were sections where they could actually drive a line truck along the Millrace and get to their power poles. They tried to keep the tree population down. You know how they trim trees? Well, they were doing it back then as well. But that path, when you got away from where the main power lines were, cow path is right. When I was a youth and I would ride the bicycle down to Shanklin Park, or we would, what was then just one ball diamond and a couple playground equipment, you could barely get a bicycle along the trail, especially north of the Murray path. I mean, if you look at the map, and I'm going to reference this now, if you understand where I grew up, we had the area from number 2, which is the dam, down to number 12, which is Plymouth Avenue, between the river and the canal on your map. That was my playground. And needless to say, we didn't have a lot of TV time, but we had a lot of alone time and out and walking around, getting mud on your shoes so your parents would throw your shoes away. And it was really an ideal youth. I noticed Rita's here, and she's kind of an adopted sister of mine, and she grew up back there a little bit too, and she grew to appreciate what was back there. And having the family so close together, you had cousins across the road, you had grandparents right up the road, and another cousin across the bridge. So we kind of had a really neat setup in the city, but not in the city.
Well, and that's really very much the way that property continue. The properties along the Millrace continue to function. They're in the city, but feel like a different place altogether. You had during the video and then after it here, you mentioned the rails that ran along here. How far down both sides? Is it correct that they ran both sides of the Millrace?
Yes. Yeah, the main lateral, there's an interesting story about these rail laterals. It's going to take too long to explain. But the Michigan and Southern ended up taking a rail lateral off of the main line right near First Street. And it ran right by where the post office is now, and across the street where the tire store was and the old Pike Street School. And it split into two pieces right before it got to Clinton Street. One section went along the east bank as far as the Hawks Furniture Complex, and then what turned into Barler's. The west bank went across on a trestle, across the tail race that went into the river there. And it went as far south as Madison Street, and it went actually farther south than Madison Street. When I was a kid, we'd be riding our bikes or walking all the way uptown. There were steel ties and rail, and Roger, you'll remember those. I don't know if you helped tear them out or not. But for the bike trail, they had to get them out of there. But it almost went to at least Pearl, Monroe or Pearl. And they were very active. We have notation in some of the rail diary that there were as many as 200 to 300 cars a month of rail cars serviced on those two laterals by Michigan Southern. They had a special engine located in Goshen to handle that traffic, and they had a rail yard. So they were pretty important to shipping stuff.
Okay, and that the highest activity of the rails along there would have been up until what, 1930s, 1940s, maybe some later.
I'd say up till the World War II, and then it started to really decline after the war.
Okay, so Roger, I've heard you and Ron talk about the work of pulling at least the ties out of the old bed there. Talk a little bit about what happened with some of those rails, or many of those rails, where they are now, for instance.
Well, right where our greenhouse is now, we pulled right up behind our building. We still had rails, and there was ties up there, and it went for probably a half a mile. And it was a cow path, is what it was. And we got up there. They hired somebody to come in and take all that out because we needed to widen that bank. It was real narrow down through there, and we took most of them ties and we put it in right there where our greenhouse is now. There was a little swamp there. We pushed it all in right there, and that's where most of them is. So you wouldn't really want to dig up in there, but there was a lot of them in there. But yeah.
And some of them were used to build up the space where the greenhouse. So Roger's talking about the greenhouse, which is behind the park's maintenance facility in Shanklin Park. If you didn't realize, there is a small greenhouse behind that is north of the maintenance building that was built in the sometime in the 80s, I think. The greenhouse.
It's probably been there about 20, 25 years.
Yeah. Okay. And so he's describing how they pulled the rails out and dumped them in there.
All up, yeah. But somebody came, and I think the rail company came and got all the rails out of there. They took all that for themselves. So, but then they widened that bank, and it's not a cow walk no more.
Yeah. Ron, I want to push our perspective a little bit further back. We've kind of been talking about the late 19th and early 20th century here. When the Millrace was completed in the late 1860s, how quickly were the first factories or first businesses developed to take advantage of the hydropower?
They were building the factories before the canal was completed. I think if you check the records between completion in October of 1868, which is when the dam was finished and the water actually flowed into the canal, there were probably at least 3 or 4 immediately ready to take the water. And within 2 years, you probably had 10 to 12 manufacturing plants along there if my memory is correct. I've got two guys out here that know as much about that as I do, Irvin and John. But the Goshen newspapers were really pressing it. They sold bonds and stocks, to fund the thing. And I do want to mention Cephas Hawks Jr. He was shown on the video a little bit out of context. He didn't have anything to do with that factory. He was the brainchild before the Civil War that said Goshen needs a hydraulic canal. And he got delayed by the war. And then when he sold the city with the newspaper's help, the idea that it'd double the population, it would create so many jobs, and they were able to sell the stock to fund it. He and another person were the highest bidder on doing the construction, and Cephas Hawks Jr. was the foreman or the head of the construction outfit. So he made sure it was done right. And the Hawks family's big in Goshen for all sorts of things. Mills, lumber, if you went through Goshen in the late 1800s, you saw Hawks on a lot of different factories and buildings, and they were associated with other businesses. But he was probably the most influential as far as having done something to Goshen that really lasted. And we're looking at a 150-year canal here, and we're still reaping the rewards of what that canal provided then and what it provides now.
That's really useful perspective to think about the power of water as a prime shaper of our community, which makes me think. I don't know whether I read this somewhere or heard it anecdotally from somebody, but I'd heard that there had been a competing idea located towards Waterford Mills to build a canal, I suppose similar to this, that may have reshaped history somewhat if that one had been built. Can you speak anything to that? Did I just make this up?
I don't think you made it up. Waterford, when you start looking at the 1830s, when Goshen was established as the county seat, and Waterford was established before Goshen was, it was actually a more thriving community. Waterford had the mill. It did have a small canal with a dam, and they did run mills out of their water down there. But unfortunately for Waterford, the railroad came through Goshen. And that's when the Hawks family said, well, you saw that big mill that was in the video. That mill was moved. The whole thing was moved from Waterford to Goshen when this canal was finished. And that's when Waterford, by the end of 2 or 3 years after 1868, every manufacturing company that had been located in Waterford, close to the Waterford, where they could get across the river, had moved to Goshen up by the canal. So I'd say that your story is accurate. There was actually a canal with a mill built in Waterford, but it just wasn't in the right spot. If the railroad had gone 12 miles north, you'd be talking about Bristol being a great town instead of Goshen being a great town, or if it had gone down farther south. So we were fortunate, and I know there's a lot of people who hate our railroads, but we were very, very fortunate that they put the Michigan and Southern rail line through Goshen, and we went all the way from Chicago to Toledo, and they're still using it.
So part of the picture you're painting is that there is a real sort of intertwining of the technology and the structures of railroad and canal. The history that I'm used to hearing is that, the railroad kind of put the canal out of business. But what you're describing is that the two in tandem were quite important to the development of the community of Goshen.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The other factor that came in first was, of course, the Indian trails that turned into the roads. I mean, we had the conjunction in Goshen of the road that went from Fort Wayne to South Bend and Chicago. And then we had the route from the south that came from Logansport that ended up in Sturgis, Michigan. So you've got a lot of things. You got your basic road system. You have your rail system that came in, and then you had the canal that followed that up. And the three together makes Goshen a very busy traffic town.
Roger, another of the things I've heard you and Ron especially talk about over the years is this kind of goes to maintenance, is some of the breaches that you were a part of along the Millrace. Maybe we can get back to you two, Ron, to get your perspective on this. But I know, Roger, would you talk a little bit about, there was one that I've heard you talk about that was just south of the maintenance building. Describe a little bit about what you recall of that and what that looked like and felt like, and how it was repaired.
Well, just probably 50 yards from the tailgates building, we had a year, I forget what year it was, but we had a lot of rain. I mean, a lot. And the Millrace was really filling up. We went down there, we worked at it. We couldn't get the gates shut at the head gates. We had this long pole that we used to go out there and we get it down, but we had to beat it down. And this particular time, we could not get it all the way down. Millrace was filling up fast, so we didn't really know what to do. So we got the street department down there, and they brought a backhoe, and we had to breach the bank right down there behind the powerhouse itself. I always called it the powerhouse, but they had to breach that where it could go down to the river. We was going to lose a lot of bank there, a lot of bank. That was scary.
I've heard you talk about how they had to bring in a backhoe, and just kind of perch it there and dig through there and hope it didn't wash down.
Yeah, that was right there where you go. You don't go down the bank where the big wall is. Right there is where they breached it at. And that was really the last thing that they didn't really know what to do. So they told them to go ahead and do it, and we had to almost drain that thing. It was so high. But we was going to lose a lot of it, so yeah, that was scary.
And then, that's one of them. And then there was another one I've heard you talk about where it actually did come through on its own on the other side of the maintenance building, I think.
Yeah, that's where you go right up to the hill, right there by our maintenance building. It got real high there, and it started running through the bank there. I think that was caused by a tree that rotted out there. That's why they don't really want trees on the water side, but we had a problem there. And then down by the dam, we had it coming over the bank, and the whole city, even the mayor's secretary, and all of us was down there sandbagging that.
When was that?
When?
Yeah, when was that?
Oh,
more or less. Which mayor was it?
Puro, I think. But we was all down there. The whole city was down there. You remember that? Where it was running right over the bank. We'd go down there, but man, yeah, they've been a few times.
Ron, do you remember details of other breaches?
Well, I don't know about other breaches, but the first one that he talked about that was at the powerhouse was complicated by the fact that the turbine blades in the powerhouse had locked up and they were closed. Which meant there was no way for the water to get through the powerhouse down into the river. And that complicated things a little bit. They had an alarm system set on that thing, so if the water got to a certain height, it would set off an alarm at the fire department, and they were supposed to respond to somebody, and that alarm did not go off. So it was almost over the bank when they had the breach at that end. And basically the water, when the canal breached, the water goes to the river, and it didn't result in any great flooding or anything like that. It just rerouted what it was going to do. You have to remember that they didn't put any lining or anything else. When they dug that thing out, you looked at those first few pictures, they had the horses with the scoops, and they just piled the dirt up on the west bank to make that west bank. And trees have roots, they rot, they leave holes. And then there's this little animal called the muskrat. that created all sorts of holes. And even back through when NIPSCO was in charge of those banks, they had people out there filling holes for muskrats and trying to keep the trees under control. In fact, they knew it was going to seep. If you walk between Murray and the curve down at College Avenue, where that storm sewer now comes underneath the race, and there's a ditch there. And that ditch was planned to take the leakage from the canal to the river. So they knew it wasn't going to be watertight. And anybody that lives down that way knows it's not going to be watertight. And you're going to have, it's like living in the river floodplain. You know you're going to get flooded. And we're still building the river plain. And we still patch holes, yeah. But it's, I've seen most of the floods that have been down there, and this last one was the worst one I've seen, but it's not the worst one we've ever had. And if you can imagine that, another 2.5, 3 feet above what we had. That's what they had in 1908. But the river was had a lot more floodplain to go into. We've filled it all in. We filled everything in.
I wanna return to that thought at some point here. Yeah, that's an important tangent. Go ahead, Roger.
I forgot to mention that when we did breach that bank down there, all the water, we got down inside the building, and we got down there and cleaned it out. And then, oh man, I tell you, it was a mess. We busted out the louvers that was down there, where we could get more water flow. We was down there, oh heck, 10, 12 hours. There was all of us down. The whole maintenance crew was down there, and that was a real nasty place to be. I'll tell you. Spiders, snakes, all kind. Oh, you just wouldn't believe it, but we got it taken care of.
And what year was that?
Oh, that's probably 30 years ago. Art Blow was our superintendent.
I'm thinking it was 86, 87, something like that.
86, 87. Okay.
Yeah, about 30 years then. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, a regular function of the Parks Department continues to be pulling, especially biological debris, weeds and duckweed and coontail and stuff out of there, especially at the tailgates. I mean, I know I've been part of that, and everybody who's worked at the Parks Department has to help out with that.
When they dug the canal, it was 10 feet deep. And it's not even close to that now. The silting problem that you read about in the papers about the dam pond itself, all that silt has been accumulating in the canal, and it's not anywhere near as deep as it was when it was built, and it's a lot shallower than it was when I was a kid.
So, Ron, did you do quite a bit of swimming in the canal?
I did no swimming in the canal. The swimming that you saw on there was before the Grayroy Drive area was fully redeveloped for residential. And when they put the first set of houses on the Grayroy Drive, the sewer system was the canal. And I think the last one of those was plugged up in probably the 60s or 70s. So when my dad swam in the canal when he was a kid, there wasn't any sewage in the water. You didn't have any of the fertilizer runoff from upstream in the Elkhart River. So it was a lot cleaner water then. I wouldn't let anybody eat the fish out of the canal right now, let alone swim in it.
So I was talking with your cousin, Ginger Miller, a couple weeks ago, and she was remembering that occasionally she and other friends would find themselves swimming here. This was after the Grayroy development, and she talked about occasionally some of them got race rash. One can wonder about what that might have been. maybe this is as good a point as any to kind of pick up on the tangent that you touched on, Ron, about the floodplain, which has been so significantly changed in the past 100 years, 150 years. We've part of the conversation here has noted how important the waterways, the Elkhart River and the Millrace especially, how these two have shaped the nature of Goshen. And kind of the silent bystander, in my opinion, then is the floodplain and the way that has acted as a buffer, and the way that we've encroached on that. We've been talking primarily right now about the history, but I wonder if we can try to project a little bit into the future, if possible, to think about what becomes of the Millrace and the relationship to the river in the next 50 years, 100 years. As a student of history, what might be some guesses? I know maybe you're not an engineer, but what do you see? What do you see as at least as possibilities for the Millrace?
Well, I think it's going to continue to be a recreational facility. I'd like to see it dredged out a little bit, but it's a lot harder to do that now than back when I was on the park board in the 80s. Back then, we could have dredged the canal and maybe filled in some of those really wide spots uptown by Madison Street or something like that. Back then, the rule was if you dredge a man-made waterway, that as long as you kept your dredgings inside the boundaries of the original man-made waterway, the Corps of Engineers didn't care what you did. Now they've included the race in their dredging rules, and so you think it's going to be expensive to get the dam pond dredged. It's going to be more expensive to do the canal, but I think sooner or later it's going to have to be done because it's down to 3 feet, 2 feet in some places. And that's a lot of accumulated dirt over 150 years when it started out 10 feet deep. But I think the bikeway is probably going to be there, and that's a good thing. I see the housing going along the East Bank is a good thing, although they're going to have to deal with a byproduct of the industrial age. I think some of the people down there at that co-housing unit have discovered that not only did Mogul Rubber and those other factories down there make goods to ship, they also made debris. And they and the rubber companies around Goshen had no problems dumping rubber, cinder, anything that happened to be dumpable, they dumped it in the canal. So what used to might have been a 100-foot wide canal is down to now 85 feet or 75 feet. So they're learning that if you just look at the canal bank as it is now and say, well, 30 feet from there we can put a foundation, you're going to be hitting landfill. So that's a major problem that is there. The west side, and I'm really kind of glad that you asked that question, because I think the west side, which was all farmland basically from the dam to Plymouth Avenue, is still retaining farmability. What Red Tail is doing with the old Hoke farm, I'm really kind of proud of him. You've got the horse pasturing, the cattle pasturing there. Larry Beachy took 35 acres, probably not because he loved trees, but the taxes were $1 an acre, and planted a classified tree farm back there on what was good prime soil, and that's an asset to the city. I'm really glad that's there as well. The Schaup farm has been turned into a park, and I see that staying up. Those are all low-lying areas that have been left alone. When you get to number 12 on your map and 13 on your map, that's landfill. The entire Shanklin Park is landfill. If you get up towards Lincoln Avenue, we're all familiar with how high the east bank of Lincoln Avenue, that land where the parking lot for the county office building is, how high that is. Well, when the canal was built, that was about 3 or 4 feet above the river. There was a good 7 to 8 foot drop from Lincoln Avenue down, going north, and same going south. So that whole area around there is all landfill. And of course the canal all got filled in. And the relief channel you saw in the movie got filled in. So, you know, that, like I said, if we got as much water as we got in 1908, the Krogers would have had about 3 more feet in their store rather than what they had this time. But I you know, the dredging is the big thing, and how to do that safely, maintain the wildlife. So I just, with the current attitude of the people that are dealing with it in the city government, I think that the Millrace has a really good future to it. I'm not sure we're going to generate power there anymore, but it's going to be an asset as long as we take care of it.
I know they looked at the possibility of generating power there 10 years ago, and deemed that it wasn't going to work. Roger, what would you say is the biggest change to the Millrace that you've seen in your 40+ years working along there, and what would you hope to see continue along there?
Well, I think the bike trail, I think that's the number one thing. You know, I really like that. People's used that. I've been working for the city for almost 42 years, and that trail there was all they had, you know, for a long time. Today, it's probably our main trail. That trail gets used more than any other trail that we got. What was that? What did you...
Well, how would you like to see the Millrace continue to be used into the future?
Same, what it's being used for right now. Walking, looking, birds and ducks and wildlife. That's why I like that.
So I think we want to have some chance for folks to ask questions to you both. But how about first, if there's any sort of last thing that either of you want to say before we kind of open it up, and if you don't have any last thing to say, that's fine too.
All I have to say is if you add the acreage up between that dam and the Plymouth Avenue, I defy too many people to say that they had near a city that many acres to run around in when you were a kid and not worry about anything. You didn't have to worry about strangers. You didn't worry about being too far from home. Your parents weren't always looking for you. They knew where you were. You ring the bell, you're going to be home. And I kind of feel sorry for the kids of today that don't have that kind of opportunity.
That's a wonderful childhood to have had. Roger, anything else you want to say before we kind of open it up?
I think I've said about all I need to say. I don't know. I still got over the 40 years that I've been at the parks, that, you know, I never thought I'd ever be at a job that long, but it's one of the best jobs I ever had. Working with Ron, we worked together for a long time. He was on our park board. He helped us get a lot of things, you know. Back when I started, we only had just one little mower and a couple weed eaters, and that's it. And we took care of all these Goshen parks, and he helped us get a lot of the equipment that we got right now. So I just hope it continues to get better.
Well, thanks to both of you. Let's see if there are some questions, and I'll just bring this around here. I see Ned and then Wilma.
I would like to hear a discussion on Maple City, and also what were the wood products that were in the industrial park, and the milling of wood or of trees to get lumber.
I'm not going to speak to the Maple City part. That just showed up as somebody's nomicker sometime. not too far from whom named us the Redskins, you know. But as far as lumber, when you consider when the settlers moved in here in the 1830 to follow the Potawatomi, everything around here was woods except the prairie out by the Elkhart, by the Goshen Airport. So lumber yards, we had tons of lumber yards. They shipped lumber. They used the mills to cut it up into raw lumber, and they planed it. We had furniture that was made here. We had the ladders, seed spreaders. You come to the museum, and we got a little supply of wooden things that were made in Goshen. Sewing machines, anything that was made with wood. We had somebody in Goshen that wanted to make something out of it. So it was a pretty big thing. And now when we run out of trees, then the lumber industry kind of goes away a little bit. Then we started making rubber for the cars.
Which come from trees, the rubber. Right?
Do you happen to know how many homes were already built along what became the canal? When it was first opened, our house was built in 1860, so it was there before the canal was built. So I was wondering if you or anyone else here would know how many homes were already in that area.
You want to guess, Roger? There wouldn't have been very many. There were a few along 3rd Street. The subdivision just south of Plymouth actually didn't develop until after the canal was completed. So when it was first put in, the houses up on Main Street didn't come until later. And the Sharp Farm had a barn on it. He owned all that land. It even included the Goshen College. So I can't. 10 may be right, Roger. Yeah, that just might be a good guess. I would have. Depends where your house is. If it was built in 1860, across from the where? Oh, okay. Well, that would be part of the 10. Yeah. On Canal Street there, probably. Yeah.
I grew up at 1625 South Main, which is just a little bit north of College Avenue, and we had a barn right near the race that had a cow. Yeah, I mean it was built before the canal was there. But at that time, 70 years ago, when I was swimming in the race was 7 feet deep, and I would jump in the race and float down to Hooven's Bridge, which at that time had a Goshen Park Department swimming hole there, with a diving board and a lifeguard. It was part of the park department.
Where would that be?
Waverly Bridge.
Right there.
Yeah, that right there.
Yeah, that's a little earlier than my swimming, but
I don't know, John. That looks pretty timely there.
But to change the subject just a little bit, one of the oldest factories in town is still there. The Independent Protection, the lightning rod factory. And some years ago, when the canal was drained, John Cutrell was messing around in the mud, and right at the Independent Protection area, he found some cauldrons that the Independent Protection had used to put molten lead in and then pour into molds. And these cauldrons are now at the Calendar Garden. Yeah, you'll see them. There are 3 or 4 or 5 of them in the landscaping.
Yeah, you'll notice that those were thrown into the canal after they weren't needed anymore.
That was John Hertzler, a native of Goshen. And I'm Irvin Beck. I like historical markers. Wouldn't it be a good idea to put some kind of markers along the canal to remember these industries and to make the point that this was originally an industrial canal? Wouldn't that be a good project for the Parks Department or the Historical Society?
Or both.
Or both, yeah. Yes, as somebody who works at the parks, yes.
I'd like to make a note. When this canal was laid out, they surveyed it before they started digging. So there's a meets and bounds, any lawyers out there? Meets and bounds description of where the canal was supposed to be dug. And those meets and bounds deeds were not recorded until after the canal was finished. Most of the time they stayed inside the description. Sometimes they were a little bit outside the description. But if you ever see an abstract for a property that was along the canal route and you have an abstract, you dig back in that far enough, you're going to find the meets and bounds description of where that canal was actually supposed to be built. And as a side note, for all you that live on the canal and own trees that fall into the canal, and the city says it's your job to clean it out, if you wanted to spend the money to have your lot surveyed, you might find that 3 or 4 or 5 feet of your property that you think is yours is actually within the canal, meets and bounds. So just a point.
I wonder, this is Barb Swartley, and we live on Canal Street, but we live right where Canal Street stops, and then it curves and becomes an alley and goes up to Wilson Avenue. But if you go down Wilson a little ways, where Clay Bottom Farm used to be, I don't know if you remember when they were there originally, but that's a Canal Street address. And if you go down a little bit further behind the A-frame on Wilson, there's also a Canal Street address. So I have often wondered what happened to Canal. If the Canal Street was originally platted to go down along the canal.
That's a really kind of a strange subdivision. I think at one point Plymouth Avenue was called North Street, and there was a street called South Street that was kind of where Jackson is now. And so what they did in between there was no through Wilson Street. I mean, it was, I think they called it Middle Street or Center Street or something. So that's one of those subdivisions where through time the streets' names have been changed, and there's no record of why. North Goshen is really full of those kind of streets.
Speaking of Canal Street, if you go to Waterford, there is a Canal Street in Waterford. And you used to be able to see the impression of a canal. I don't know if you still can or not. And across the river, there are some formations that survive of industry and I think maybe accommodation to water power. So some of those traces are still there.
Any other questions out here? I can see that you're burning with questions. It's a little bit warm.
I have an odd point of information for you. Remember when I talked about in the video that there were 2 dams in Goshen? There were actually 3. In 1861, or by 1861, Rock Run had been dammed just east of Cottage Avenue and had backed up a pond there, and they actually dug another race that went all the way to Oak Ridge. So there was a Rock Run, and then there was a race that went all the way to Oak Ridge for some milling purposes. After that, it was filled in, and that right-of-way where that race had been became the right-of-way for the Big 4 Railroad that curved over and went around that way.
Hi, my name is Tim Swartzentruber. I have a couple questions. So, when the new dam was put in, was there a reason why they didn't reinstall the fish ladder? And how has that affected the river and the fish? Also, did the current in the canal, was that ever more than it is now, or has it always been slow? And if so, then I'm still not clear on how the energy was made with the waterway.
The canal was planned for a 14-foot fall. When I was a kid, the race bank was maintained by NIPSCO, and they ran the water a good 2 feet higher than it is now. They had all 3 gates open at times on the head gates. So you had a very fast current. You did not want to fall in the water at the head gates because of the whirlpools and eddies that were in there. So they had a sufficiently high water supply to run their turbines. We can't do that now because the bank won't stand it. What was the other question?
Fish ladder.
Oh, we were really disappointed when they pulled the fish ladder out. They just didn't have the money to put it in, I don't think. Aaron, do you know the impact?
I'm not an aquatic biologist, so I don't. I mean, we can certainly guess what it means. It's just that the kind of biology that is below the dam is different than it is above, and it would be reflected in different kinds of fish populations. But that would probably also rebound to other kinds of populations too. We'd have to get Dara Deegan in here to tell us about that.
So how hard would it be to have one put in, and how expensive would it be for a future project, number one? And then the other question was, in the video I saw this, the old foundation over by the Reef Interpretive Center. I've often wondered what that was, and they said what, but I didn't catch it in the video. What was that?
Barn Foundation.
Barn Foundation.
That was the old Murray barn. Yeah. And so that's a place that I often stop with kids that I take on field trips back into the woods. We stop there, and we talk about, what in the world is this stack of stones here? And they tell me it's a cave, or they tell me it's a place where bears live, or something like that. And we kind of converse a little bit, and we finally get around to, well, it's a foundation, and that once upon a time there was a farm here. And they look around and see all the trees, and they say, "What? A farm?" But that's the history. It's the history.
With the recent news of the alligator in Plymouth, have you ever seen an alligator on the Millrace?
No.
No, but we have seen gar. And pike and all sorts of.
Mary Lehman Yoder. I'm intrigued. I think it's not only the Goshen story, but other places where what we now see as a place of beauty and recreation and enjoyment, and we want to sustain the animal life there, was industrial. And it was certainly used, and you're telling me at some points it was sort of used up, or at least used recklessly. Okay, so the industry's kind of died out, but that doesn't necessarily make a transition to, we can reclaim this as something beautiful, something recreational, something restorative. And I wonder how that happens. There's certainly other waterways where people want to live because they're beautiful, and there are waterways where people live because it's industrially driven for any number of reasons, transportation or energy. I remember as a college student walking along the Millrace, and on a narrower path, although not exactly a cow path. It wasn't that long ago. Anyway, seeing those old factories and thinking, wow, this is a gorgeous place. Why are these old factories here? Why doesn't the city want to reclaim this and make it something else? Well, the city has. But it's that transition that I wonder about. How that happens, where vision for that comes. I don't know, maybe the people sitting in the room are the people that helped that happen, and I just don't know those stories.
What, you want a political statement? I've been involved with that too. I know that the Goshen bike trail system was talked about in Goshen. You saw in 1897, they were talking about being able to ride bicycles down there. Obviously, after the railroad tracks were put in and some other industrial uses, they couldn't use it. But the city of Goshen administration was talking about bike paths as long ago as 1976. So there's been a gradual, I think, national awareness of the economic, of the ecology. When you see the Cuyahoga River burning in Cleveland and things like that, I mean, it gets your attention. And we've had a fairly long run of what I term progressive administrations in Goshen that have seen the virtue of putting recreation into play and to develop for other purposes. You're not going to find that everywhere, but certainly this makes us a little bit of a island, maybe, in a larger community that maybe doesn't see it that way. I want to be honest, there was one bike trail that I opposed. I opposed the one on 8th Street because I thought it belonged on 9th Street. And now I guess they're going to put it on 9th Street. So patience is a virtue at times. Frustrating, but a virtue. But I think the whole country is awakening. Well, maybe not the whole country. There are states that aren't quite up to snuff. The West Coast is definitely with Goshen on their reclamation. I do want to make a point. If you do go nationwide, anybody that's got a floodplain, you're going to find lots of parks because it's the easiest use for a floodway is to put a park there because it's interesting. If you come to the museum and look at you're all familiar with Rogers Park, all right? Developed across, there was a bridge built from Clinton Street across the river next to the canal, and it ended up at Rogers Park, which was the main Goshen Park for years and years and years. They built a pavilion there when they opened the park. It's on stilts. All right, it was built up about 10 feet above ground level because they knew it was going to flood, and they didn't want to get the basketball court wet that was in the pavilion. When that thing burned down, the administration then just put it on the ground. So sometimes those people back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were pretty smart.
I want to put a quick plug in, too, for some of the information that we've been fortunate to gather and try to help make more accessible from the Historical Society. There's some really wonderful documents that you'll be able to find on the Goshen.Guide and through the Historical Society site coming up, or just going into the Historical Society Museum and seeing some of the documents firsthand. But I think of the one document that comes to mind when I heard your question was a thesis done in the 80s by Heather Hardy that talks about the redevelopment of the area around Lincoln Avenue. Imagining what that might look like to clean up some of the dumps that were, or the scrap yards that were there at that point, and just beginning to see how the Millrace could be redeveloped into something with a broader community interest. So there's a number of these reports that have looked at redevelopment and visions for how things would grow over the years that capture how the thinking in the community has been at different points in time. So I'm grateful for the Historical Society for holding on to a lot of these documents, and look forward to seeing some of what is dug up here in the months ahead. There's from the diary of the construction of the Millrace through some of the early accounts of industry that grew up along it. There's some real gems of information. Well, thank you very much, Ron, for all you shared this evening, and for you, Roger, for joining us here. Thank you, Aaron, for facilitating this conversation and kind of pulling some of these stories out. And thank you all very much for coming out and joining us this evening. And if you have any questions, feel free to hang around for a bit and ask. And again, we'll be back here August 9th, focusing on the arts. So thank you again.